Welcome everybody to part 3 of Why the Rings of Power Sucks. Today, we are going to be taking an in-depth look at the Pelagir Subplot as well as the Khazad-Dum Subplot. If you haven't seen part 1 or part 2 and would like to watch either of those before watching this one, then the link to those videos will be in the description. However, you don't have to watch the first 2 parts in order to understand part 3, so if you'd like to just watch this one first and then cycle back to the first 2 afterwards, that's totally fine as well. But without wasting any more time, let's get started, shall we? We'll start with the Pelagir Subplot first and then transition to the Khazad-Dum plot afterwards. So the Pelagir plotline starts with Beric the horse going off to save Isildur from the Black Forest. In doing so, he overcomes many orcs and giant spiders to save this man, making him one of the best and most heroic characters in the whole show. Yeah, you heard me right. A horse is one of the best characters in Rings of Power, and I will stand by that claim in all seriousness. Isildur and Beric make their way through the desolate waste of what was once the Southlands, until Isildur passes by a carriage and gets stabbed. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is our first introduction to the newest insufferable bitch of the show, Estrid. She might even give Galadriel a run for her money as my most despised character of Rings of Power. But anyways, Estrid stabs Isildur because she believed him to be an orc, which is just beyond stupidity. There is no logical reason for Estrid to believe that Isildur was in fact an orc. Orcs and men look nothing alike. Isildur isn't wearing any orc-like armor of any kind, and orcs are famous for their animal-like noises and grunts that they make, all of which Isildur does none of as he approaches the carriage. Isildur should be very angry at Estrid for doing something so stupid, and he is admittedly at first, but brushes it off very quickly after he presumably deems Estrid attractive, thus kicking off the beginnings of one of the dumbest subplot romances in modern fiction. Isildur decides to take Estrid with him, despite him having no reason to do so, especially after what she did, but he does so anyway. They make their way to the old Númenórean settlement of Pelagir after Isildur deems that that is the most likely place in which Elendil led the survivors of the eruption of Mount Doom. But they run into a little bit of trouble along the way, but don't worry, here comes Arondir. God, this guy really just spawns in anywhere whenever the plot needs him to. And I find this scene so funny because Arondir literally just flips on in, kills a bunch of dudes, saves Isildur and Estrid, and then just leaves. It's literally just, oh, here I come, let's kill a bunch of people, okay, looks like everybody's dead, well, see ya, the plot no longer needs me. Like, what? Where are you going? This whole sequence is just bizarre in the way that it's written. But anyways, Isildur and Estrid follow Arondir back to Pelagir since they're all going to go to the same place. And this is where the Pelagir subplot splits off in a bunch of different directions. And there are times where they overlap each other. So for now I'm going to follow Arondir, but I'll switch back and forth as I see fit based on how the story unfolds. So Arondir tries to pick up the pieces of his and Theo's relationship after the death of Bronwyn back in Season 1. Theo hates Arondir, however, and basically tells him to fuck off, and that he doesn't really want to see him anymore. Now, I don't know why Theo is so hostile towards Arondir. He doesn't really have any reason to. But the show feels like it just has to artificially add a sense of tension between these two characters, even though logically it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The show tries to make the point that Theo hates Arondir because he isn't his real father, and he presumably was trying to act like his father ever since his relationship with Bronwyn blossomed. But this hatred feels very contrived considering how good of a partner and protector Arondir was for Theo and Bronwyn, and how nice he has been towards Theo. But since Bronwyn is dead, Theo comes to the irrational conclusion, welp, you're dead to me now. Go away, elf. And that's exactly what Arondir does, for the time being. We then cut to Theo chatting with Isildur. Theo tells Isildur he knows where Beric is after he ran off, and Isildur would obviously want to know where Beric is. But Theo pulls out the classic, no, come back at midnight, only then will I tell you. So we have to wait until midnight for reasons unknown. Theo then leads Isildur out into the woods, where Beric is being held hostage by a group of wild men. And here we have a pretty major plot gap. We never saw Theo discover where Beric actually was or how he knows that this specific horse belongs to Isildur. Now this all could have happened off screen, but once again, this whole sequence is all contrived in an effort to move the plot forward. While Isildur is trying to free Beric, Theo then reveals himself to the group of wild men for no reason whatsoever. What he hopes to gain by this is unclear. But a fight breaks out, Isildur escapes with Beric, and Theo is kidnapped by a tree. Welp, that sucks, Theo. Guess you're just gonna have to wait for good old Arondir Arondir to save you. And that's exactly what happens. Skip forward to episode 4, and Arondir starts leading the search for Theo. But before that, we are subjected to this awful cringe fest of a scene, as well as Estrid getting discovered for being a liar by Arondir. Thank God, it is about time someone realized that this girl was sketch, because apparently Isildur couldn't. We then jump to the three of them venturing off to find Theo, because Arondir believes that Estrid will know where Theo is. And they quickly find themselves in a new sticky situation, or should I say, muddy situation. And what follows is probably the most pointless scene in the whole episode. This whole sequence of Isildur and Arondir accomplishes absolutely nothing and doesn't progress the story in any meaningful way. All it does is just burn time. The only reason I can come up with for why it was included is because the writers probably felt it had been too long without some type of action, and they also want to convince the audience to trust Estrid again. But if that's really what you wanted to do, there are much better ways that you could have done that instead of just having Estrid put a stick in the mud in a hopeless attempt to fish them out. She better be thanking that worm thing, cause there's no way she actually thought that this was going to work. Arondir then gives Estrid the key to undo her shackles, which doesn't make any sense because Estrid has not proven herself trustworthy. Even if you want to say that Estrid's stick in the mud plan was her trying to save them, and that makes her trustworthy now, Arondir didn't see that because he was inside the belly of a giant mudworm. And now, presumably, since Arondir is giving Estrid the key, he must trust that her story was real, even though she hasn't proven herself as a trustworthy person. Ultimately though, Isildur is the one that helps use the key to undo Estrid's shackles. And hey, what do you know, I was right. But wait. Estrid's screwed now, unless a bunch of trees show up at exactly the right time. And what follows is a bunch of trees showing up at exactly the right time. The tree stomps in angrily and slaps Estrid with all its might into a rock. Wow, out of all the ways I thought Estrid would have died, I was not expecting that. Wait. She's alive? Are you kidding me? Are you really trying to tell me that the human female survives getting bitch slapped by a tree and goes flying into a rock 50 miles an hour? Yeah, my ass she's alive. But that's the power of plot armor, ladies and gentlemen. Arondir then has a chat with the trees, and after the trees give a bunch of exposition, and Arondir calms the crazy tree down, the trees give back Theo. Two things of note happen here. For one, Arondir promises the trees that he's going to help protect the forest, a plot point that the show just seems to forget later in the season. And Theo finally comes around to respecting Arondir. A character arc on the surface I would think is mostly functional, but isn't really that functional when you take into consideration that Theo's starting point as a character, which was hating Arondir, felt very contrived. Meanwhile, here comes Hagen, and the beginning of our love triangle. While this love triangle is definitely really bad, I'm almost hesitant to even call it a love triangle, because as we'll later see, Hagen doesn't really put up any type of a fight, and the only reason that Estrid stays in the end is because Isildur wasn't able to bribe her on the ship. But I'll discuss that more when we get to it. So after this whole clusterfuck of a sequence, Arondir decides to leave Pelagir and run across the entire continent so he can join in when we get to the Battle of Eregion. So he has effectively at this point left the Pelagir plotline, so for what's left of this subplot, we can mainly now shift our focus solely towards Isildur, Estrid, and Theo. So from here, the show barely spends any more time in Pelagir, and we now have to jump all the way to halfway through episode 8 until the show finally decides to return here. So Estrid walks in on Isildur to have an exchange where she finally lays out her feelings towards him. During the exchange, she mentions that Hagen, her betrothed, has started the construction of a home for the two of them, and asks the gods to keep their love strong as long as the home stood. But Estrid doesn't care, and says in fact that she felt sick when he said that, and then says to Isildur that she wants to be with him, further solidifying that Estrid is an awful human being. And the writers try to play this off like it's romance, but it's not. They clearly have no understanding of what romance actually is. After cringing for a minute straight, we now have the arrival of Kemen from Numenor, and he has come to establish Pelagir as a military base for reasons unknown. Right when he arrives, Hagen tells Kemen to listen to Theo because he's the Lord of Pelagir, and he is the son of Bronwyn. And for some reason, they write it in a way in which Kemen actually knows who Theo is. Except there's no reason that he should know any of these people, considering that he's never been to Middle-earth since the beginning of this show, and has never met any of these people. Kemen then discovers that Isildur is alive, but after Isildur tries to bribe Estrid onto the ship back to Numenor, Kemen's like, "Oh no, she's a low man. You can't bring a low man on the ship, and if you disagree with me, I'll slaughter your horse." Oh my god. We'll get to Kemen eventually when I tackle the Numenor subplot, but the fact that they've chosen to characterize Kemen this season as the pure embodiment of evil is not only laughable, but also one of the worst attempts at writing a villain I have ever seen in my life. The last plot point that we see from Pelagir is Isildur sailing off back to Numenor, and Estrid looks upon him leaving and seems to be very sad. And that's it. That's the end of Pelagir. In summary, the Pelagir subplot is terrible, and an absolute waste of time. While Pelagir doesn't necessarily feel the most disconnected from the show and the overall narrative, that title goes to the Runes subplot, I actually think that it was the most worthless. The only reason that the Pelagir subplot exists is because there are a bunch of loose story ends and characters from Season 1 that weren't really tied up very well, so the show has to just figure out something to do with them, because writing them out of the show entirely would feel extremely odd. Pelagir really just sums up to a bunch of characters running around doing shit in the woods, and it doesn't accomplish anything of real significance to the overall story at large. So, with all that said, that's it for Pelagir. Let's move on to the Khazad-Dum subplot, which has a lot more meat to it and overall significance to the story at large. So, we pick up back in the Khazad-Dum plotline at the beginning of episode 2. Prince Durin has been banished by his father, so he and Diza are now being forced to scrape by to survive. Diza is able to sense something bad is about to happen, so she tells everyone to brace themselves. And what follows is an earthquake inside of the mountain, resulting in multiple large boulders falling. The earthquake also causes the sun shafts to collapse, rendering the dwarves unable to grow new crops. Because of this, Diza decides to go see the king. However, the fact that King Durin allows Diza to have an audience with him is unclear, considering that King Durin and the prince aren't on speaking terms and Diza is Prince Durin's wife. The only logical assumption that can be made is because she is a stone singer, she is allowed entrance. But, considering that there are multiple other stone singers, the fact that she was allowed in or summoned still doesn't make perfect sense. Diza fails in her singing attempt, which forces Narvi to begin digging without an identified safe path to dig. The king and Diza then have a brief conversation about the feud between himself and Prince Durin. It's mostly a functional conversation, so I don't really have any complaints here. However, we then cut to Prince Durin in the mines, and there is so much wrong here in such a short scene. After struggling to finish his mining work, which already seems a little bit out of character because Durin has been shown throughout the series to be a very capable dwarf when it comes to hands-on physical laborious activity, he's then verbally heckled and bullied by some nearby dwarves. The fact that these dwarves don't have an immense amount of respect for him, regardless of whether or not the king stripped him of his title, I found pretty unbelievable. He makes some threatening remarks back, but when he is shoved to the ground, he just takes it. He does nothing. This completely goes against how Durin has been characterized this whole show. The disrespect I already had issues with, but Durin not fighting back, acting like some pacifist, just pissed me off. The writers definitely wrote this as a means of making Durin's situation sympathetic, but they clearly did not take into account at all that it does not align in the slightest with how he has been characterized. If you really wanted to show Durin in a vulnerable situation, this is not the way you should have gone about it. Episode 2 finishes in the Khazad-Dum section with a conversation between Diza and Prince Durin. Now this is a scene with things that I like as well as things I don't. On one hand, Diza has once again been shown to be capable of appealing to someone's desires for the sake of the common good. She does that here with Prince Durin the same way that she did earlier with King Durin. Honestly, Diza's characterization this episode has been overall pretty strong, so I will absolutely give credit where credit is due. But on the other hand, however, Diza leverages Prince Durin by feeding him year-old bread. When Prince Durin asks her, "What the fuck is this?" she explains that the king won't let the dwarves go to the surface to harvest crops, and that he has to put aside his differences with him and get through to him. Now, the fact that the king doesn't let his people go to the surface in order to harvest food or trade food would imply that the king does not care about his people. But it has never been characterized this whole show that that's the type of king that Durin is. So once again, we have yet another major character contradiction, this time for King Durin. Skip forward to episode 3, and Prince Durin and Diza are summoned to a Region by Celebrimbor. He tells them that they have crafted rings of power for them, rings with the power to heal their mountain. Now, I already mentioned it back in part 1, but the fact that Annatar even knew about the recent development to tell Celebrimbor, when it's been stated that King Durin hasn't let any dwarves up to the surface, makes absolutely no sense. And it is a pretty severe plot hole. Prince Durin is hesitant to bring the offer back to King Durin because they are no longer on speaking terms. However, Annatar persuades him by using information that he couldn't possibly know about. Celebrimbor allows the dwarves time to think it over, even though Annatar does doesn't want to give them that time. This whole conversation, Sauron or Anatar has acted very suspicious to say the least, and Durin is rightly skeptical. However, Disa is not. She pretty much just blindly goes along with it because she believes that this could possibly be the last hope of restoring their mountain because no other solutions have presented themselves. Disa tells Prince Durin that he's got to dwarf up and take this information to the king or else she will. We cut to a bunch of merchants outside of King Durin's throne room begging for food. The fact that the king still to this point hasn't allowed for any trade just further deepens the fact that he seemingly doesn't care about his people. And in comes Prince Durin to finally reconcile with his father. Prince Durin lays out the nature of Celebrimbor's offer to the king, and adds that he does not trust the power that is being forged for them in Eregion. Now the prince did not have to come and tell the king this offer, for one, because he didn't trust it, and two, because they weren't even on speaking terms. But we can seemingly come to the conclusion that he's done this because he trusts the judgment of his king, and felt like it was his duty to make the decision of this offer for the kingdom. Now, on the surface, I wouldn't have a problem with this. But the issues arise when you consider the fact that Durin's mindset about altering the fates of beings in Middle-earth has changed from Season 1 to Season 2, off-screen. In Season 1, Prince Durin betrayed his father by supplying the elves with mithril as a means to save themselves, despite the king ordering against it, believing that the elves' fate in Middle-earth would ultimately be decided by the Valar. But in Season 2, Prince Durin has seemingly flip-flopped, now believing that they shouldn't use the power to save themselves because it could be altering a fate that was predetermined for them by higher beings. So, as you now see, this is yet another major character contradiction and inconsistency for Prince Durin. Skip forward to the end of the episode. King and Prince Durin, as well as Disa, are in attendance for the finishing of the forging of the Dwarven Rings. Now, obviously considering that they're already here, the decision by King Durin to accept the offer from Celebrimbor happened off-screen. You'd think that would be a vital piece of not only plot, but also characterization for the king, but it's just completely glossed over. It's especially a missed opportunity for some character back and forth between the king and the prince, considering that the king has gone against the prince's recommendations that they not take the offer. But instead, this short scene solely serves as a cliffhanger for episode 4, ending episode 3. In fact, we actually have to skip forward to episode 5 until we return back to Khazad-Dum. So King Durin, for the time being, is now in possession of all 7 of the Dwarven Rings of Power, but this is the one in particular that he chooses to wear. Immediately, King Durin starts to fundamentally change as a person, eventually becoming insane within the span of a few days or weeks as we see later in the season. Now this particular aspect of the show I take extreme issue with, but I already discussed it back in part 1, so I'll skip over it for now. King Durin is escorted down to one of the tunnels that the dwarves are currently digging in an attempt to find the light. They seemingly haven't made much progress, but King Durin very quickly points out a spot for them to dig due to the powers of the ring. Now, why this ring gives him this particular power is never explained, which is another issue in of itself. So King Durin starts to dig in the spot that he pointed out, despite the wall being a foundation wall. Foundation meaning that the entire structural integrity of the tunnel depends on the wall not being damaged. But despite this fact, Durin decides to dig, putting not only himself but the lives of many others at risk. So we logically have to assume that he's doing this because he has put full faith in the Ring of Power, despite him never actually using it before. He has no idea whether this ring is going to do the things that he thinks it can do. And this goes against how King Durin has been earlier characterized, that being a cautious person. Now, you could chalk this all up to he's acting out of character because of the ring, but then that just cycles back to my original issue with the ring fundamentally changing who he is as a person in such a short amount of time. But anyways, the mountain is seemingly healed in a matter of minutes. There's no real nuance or struggle to the situation. They're just able to quickly and easily overcome the problem that they've been dealing with for half a season. I'm not going to say that it isn't possible, I just wish it was more fleshed out than it was. It's very glossed over. A short time later, Disa buys a gemstone for presumably her daughter's birthday. However, the stone is extremely expensive due to the king imposing a 100% tax on all goods. The greed of the king has reached insane levels in such a short amount of time. So much so that he would financially bankrupt his people, just so he can add a few more coins to his riches. Also, this tax would utterly destroy their economy, but I guess he's just too stupid to realize that. Disa drops the stone, and it rolls off into the distance, down a dark cave. Disa tries to retrieve it while looking like a bumbling idiot. And of course, the stone makes its way right to this very specific spot, despite the odds of it making here so perfectly are next to impossible. But the reason the writers did this was so that they could insert yet another reminder that yes, remember that there is in fact a Balrog down here, something that will become relevant very shortly. Meanwhile, King Doran has summoned representatives from the other dwarven kingdoms to tell them about the Rings of Power. Now this is the first time that anybody from any of the other dwarven kingdoms has been depicted on screen, and they get a total of 0 lines of dialogue. It would be interesting to know their perspectives on these matters, but the writers don't care to depict it. King Doran says that in order for the other dwarven masters to receive their Rings of Power, it will come at a cost. Presumably, that cost will be in the form of gold. The fact that Durin is charging for possession of these other 6 rings when they're not even for him is stupid, but remember, King Durin is greedy now, guys. It's also completely glossed over, but King Durin is likely assuming that the other dwarf lords are in a specific need of these Rings of Power, but why? Are the other dwarven kingdoms in a state of desperation, similar to how Khazad-Dum was? Or do they just want power for power's sake? Don't know, the show doesn't care to answer. We then cut to King Durin and Narvi discussing digging deeper in the mountain. Narvi advises against it, but King Durin decides that yes, we are going to continue digging, even though it breaks the mining laws that I put in place decades ago. You want to know why? Remember, he's greedy now, guys. There's literally no nuance whatsoever. He's just made a complete 180 as a character. Prince Durin then enters the room, advising the king himself not to keep digging, because Disa has heard something evil lurking deep in the mountain from earlier in the episode, and that digging deeper could mean awakening it and wreaking havoc. But King Durin doesn't take more than 2 seconds to consider this warning, because he wants money. This also probably would have been a good time for Prince Durin to once again bring up his suspicions of Anatar and his suspicions of the rings, but he doesn't. We then get a short scene of Prince Durin seeking out Celebrimbor to ask him what the fuck is wrong with the rings. Celebrimbor assures him that there is no fault in the rings because they use the exact same process for the dwarven rings as they did with the elven rings. Prince Durin once again raises his suspicions of Anatar. That's really the only purpose of this scene. It's a means for Celebrimbor to develop suspicions of Anatar for himself. Something that should have happened far earlier, but at least the writers are finally trying. But this doesn't really amount to much because once Celebrimbor confronts Anatar about the faults of the dwarven rings, he's just able to easily manipulate him again. So we are once again in a state of Celebrimbor being Anatar's stupid little puppet. Prince Durin then tries to convince the king of the devilry inside of the rings, but he backs off when his father decides to give him back the title of prince, and that seemingly wins him over for the time being. What? Durin, what are you doing? Your princeship doesn't matter in this situation. You are all going to die if your father continues to dig. That should be your only priority. You have to convince your father at all costs that if you continue to dig, that you'll inevitably wake up the giant devil monster. And then he has the balls to go back to Disa and say, "Sorry, honey, I tried." Fuck no, you didn't. Your passive attitude and inability to truly put your foot down on your father's actions could be the possible destruction of your kingdom. But anyway, later on, Anatar has come to speak with King and Prince Durin in person. Although, why the prince is in attendance doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. It's said that Anatar summoned him to the king's chamber personally, although why I don't really know, considering that he's come to speak with the king. It also doesn't make a whole lot of sense on his part, considering that surely by this point, Anatar should be well aware of the fact that Prince Durin doesn't like him. So his presence in the room will only make it more difficult for him to achieve what he is trying to achieve from his conversation with the king. The only reason the prince is here is because the writers want him to be in attendance to bear witness to the conversation, despite it not making a shred of sense. Anatar tells the king that they are in desperate need of more mithril because Eregion is at risk of invasion, and they want to finish their Rings of Power before that happens. King Durin declines, sends Anatar on his way, and it's not exactly clear why he has done this until about a minute later, where he explains to Prince Durin that whoever controls the mithril will be able to control the wars that are seemingly on the horizon of Middle-earth. So now, not only does King Durin want to be super fucking rich, he also seemingly wants world domination in some form, presumably in the form of the trade market. He wants full control over the most valuable resource in Middle-earth, despite the fact that withholding some of it could mean the death of the elves in Eregion, the same elves that forged for him the ring that saved his kingdom, a ring that he now loves so much. Prince Durin and Disa then come up with a plan. Disa says that they will put their bodies in front of that mine in order to stop the king. The prince replies that that will either mean their death or arrest, but Disa replies to that by saying it will mean showing the people that the king is no longer fit to rule. That would imply that they believe that them getting arrested would result in a revolution against the king. Although it's never really made clear by the show that that would be guaranteed to be the case because we never get any glimpses into how the common dwarf feels about the current state of the kingdom. Skip to episode 7. King Durin is informed by Narvi that Eregion is under siege. But instead of really addressing that situation at all, the king replies with,
"Come on, Narvi, what the fuck are you doing? Get back control of that mine. Every second you waste costs me money. Money, money, money."
When Narvi and the other dwarf guards return to the mine, Prince Durin and Disa stand armed and ready to defend it. At this point, Narvi just decides, you know what, I'm done with this shit. The king is crazy, I stand with you. Now, I don't take issue with Narvi making this decision. After all, any sane person would. What I do take issue with is how easily we get from point A to point B. There is no intense conversation to convince Narvi to make this decision. There's no physical altercation. No, he just decides out of thin air that this is what he's going to do. It's just very vanilla character writing. Narvi then informs the prince that Elrond has come to see him. Durin and Elrond then proceed to have a brief exchange, where they both get on the same page of the current state of things. Elrond tells Durin that he needs his help in aiding the elves in the Battle of Eregion. But before anything else meaningful is discussed, the show just cuts away. By the way, that's a really bad habit that Rings of Power is littered with. We'll be in the middle of a really important scene, but it will just cut away in the middle of it, before it's allowed to properly finish, and it's really annoying. We then cut to Prince Durin's speech, and by the time we get to the speech, we are forced to assume a couple things that must have happened off-screen. For one, Durin deciding to accept Elrond's plea for help happened off-screen. And also, Durin has somehow rallied hundreds and hundreds of dwarves, an army the size capable of giving aid to Eregion, all without the king noticing. Or does he know? Did Prince Durin overthrow the king off-screen and now he controls the will of the people? Or are just enough people fed up with the king that they are willing to follow the prince now? We of course do not get an answer to this. The army assembles at the west gate, and right as Prince Durin and the army are about to leave for Eregion, Narvi comes rushing in to tell him that the king has turned his axe on him and his men. He says the king is intent on continuing the dig, all by himself, all the way to the Balrog, and that Prince Durin must recall the army. Now, considering the situation, and considering that King Durin is likely a more powerful force with the Ring of Power at his hand, it might make sense to recall a small fraction of the army to make sure that the king doesn't unleash the Balrog. But recalling the entire army doesn't make a shred of sense. Someone else besides the prince could very easily lead the remaining 80 to 85% of the army to Eregion, but they forego this basic common sense because the writers need the plot to happen. Skip forward to the beginning of episode 8, and Prince Durin confronts the king. He confronts him one-on-one, however, so clearly he did not need to recall the entire army. The two have a brief exchange of dialogue, which admittedly isn't terrible, before King Durin is able to break through the wall. Keep in mind that the king has managed to dig all the way to the Mithril entirely by himself, which I find to be a stretch at best. King Durin then shows off the riches of the Mithril on the mountain to the prince, but before they really have much of a chance to soak it all in, the Balrog shows up with the intent on killing them. Welp, I guess it took the big fire demon showing up right in front of him before the king realized that he fucked up. Prince Durin fends off an attack from the Balrog, which sends him flying into the rocks. The force of that blow probably should have killed him, but the prince has plot armor, so he survives. The two then have a brief moment to say their goodbyes, before the king sacrifices himself in something that looks straight out of a Mario game. Also, before the king sacrifices himself, he takes off the Ring of Power, and clearly, judging by the shot, the prince does not have enough time to retrieve it, so the ring is presumably lost. However, there is a shot later in the episode where we see that the ring was in fact retrieved, but how exactly? Your guess is as good as mine. The scene ends with the tunnel collapsing, seemingly sealing off the Balrog's entry into the rest of the mountain. Skip forward to the end of the episode, and Prince Durin, now soon to be King Durin IV, receives news from Narvi of the status of Eregion. He is told that Eregion has fallen, and Elrond has helped lead the survivors off to somewhere. But before Durin is able to order aid to the survivors, Narvi and Disa are quick to tell him that he has more pressing matters to deal with. Apparently, Durin has a brother. I guess he was mentioned once across the entirety of the past 2 seasons, but apparently this brother is advancing claims for the throne. So, stay tuned for season 3, I guess. Ugh, Jesus Christ. And with that, the Khazad-Dum plot has reached its end for Season 2. In summary, the Khazad-Dum plot, similar to every other plot in the show, is not good. I will go as far to say that it is probably the best plotline in Season 2, but saying that it's the best plotline in a show like Rings of Power isn't much of a compliment at all. Khazad-Dum sadly suffers mostly from terrible character writing and character inconsistencies which can't be overlooked. Some of them are egregious enough to break the story. Even though the Khazad-Dum plot was also bad in Season 1, at least after that season's conclusion, we were left with some somewhat functional characters. However, Season 2 has actively broken every single one of them, so any interest that I may have had for the storyline has been completely thrown out the window. It's a shame because with better writing, the Khazad-Dum plot could have very well been salvaged, but instead, it has been sunk deep into the ground. And with all that said, I'm going to cut it off here for part 3. For those of you that have made it this far, if you've enjoyed the video, then please do me a favor by leaving a like and hitting that subscribe button. Also, stay tuned for part 4, which will be the final part of this series. It is currently in the works, and I will get it out as soon as I can. If you're watching this video a significant amount of time in the future, then you can find the link to part 4, or any of the other parts in the description, as well as in the outro. And finally, if you have any of your own thoughts about the Pelagir plotline, the Khazad-Dum plotline, or just Rings of Power in general, then be sure to leave them in the comments below, because I will, as always, be interested to hear your guys' thoughts. But anyways, that's all I got for today. I will see you guys in the next one.